Hi everyone, welcome to Redesign, Repurpose, Reskin, Renovate. The learning objectives for this session are shown here, and we'll be following up with a survey and with more information on how to receive credit from AIA. We'll collect questions submitted to the Q&A box throughout the session, and if our speaker isn't able to get to all of your questions, we'll have him answer them in writing and share them on the website after the teach-in. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this session, Carl Elefante. Carl Elefante, FAIA, FAPT, is Principal Emeritus with Quinn Architecture, where he served as Design Principal on architecture, preservation, and community revitalization projects. Known for coining the phrase, "The greenest building is one that is already built," Mr. Elefante writes and lectures nationally on historic preservation and sustainable design topics. Mr. Elefante is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and Association for Preservation Technology. And in 2018, Mr. Elefante served as the 94th president of the American Institute of Architects. Carl, take it away.
Well, thank you, Erin. And it's really great to be here, everyone. Voice okay?
Voice is okay, not seeing your screen yet.
Let me just restart it. It says I'm on. Maybe some tech person in the background might be able to help us out with this. But at any rate, I'm going to go ahead and continue. Zoom tells me that my video is on.
We look good. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. And I will share my screen. So hopefully there we go. So again, really great to be here. Sorry that this morning's session got interrupted, but it's clearly a very important day here and very happy to be part of it. As Erin said in my introduction, I've been kind of an existing buildings guy for quite a long time, a lot of my career. And it has a remarkable importance in this conversation about climate action, and both in terms of operational and embodied carbon issues, but especially on the embodied carbon side. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of today's comments on that. I want to begin with just talking a little bit about my own perspective and who I am. I've been enormously fortunate as an architect, and I like to think of Francois Curie, who always starts his speeches by talking about how privileged we are and how fortunate we are, and I feel very much, to kind of coming from that place. I've gotten to work in some of the most incredible places in the country. Just really legacy buildings that have been a great privilege to help in their stewardship of. And it kind of gives you a perspective on the value of existing buildings, which frankly, most architects really don't get that exposure. And in fact, most people in the building professions, the building industry, don't really have that opportunity to just sort of steep in the value of these existing buildings. And not every one of them looks this wonderful, but it really gives you a sense of valuing the existing building stock. I also want to talk a little bit about where we are today in 2020 and just kind of how oddly familiar this feels to the era in the late 60s when I entered architecture school, and the world that existed then of just this kind of endless possibilities. I mean, the moonwalk. How could you even imagine that it would be only 66 years from the first flight to landing on the moon? Just unbelievable possibilities. And then also a strangely disrupted time, which I think here in 2020, with climate change and with COVID-19, we have the same sense of we're just struggling to get to the next phase, and climate change is such a key part of that. Another part of this background for me was really growing up in the Camelot of the Kennedy era, and very much being impressed as a preteen with his inaugural address. And a lot of people remember that for the line, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," which is actually the kind of conclusion of the speech. And that part of the speech was actually really important and gets forgotten. And what that part of the speech was is captured in this quote: Kennedy accepting the challenges of his generation. And the challenge of his generation was nuclear holocaust, was mutually assured destruction. And his concerns about the world that he faced were real. In fewer than 2 years, the Cuban Missile Crisis was what was in the Oval Office that he was facing, and probably the closest brink that the world has ever come to very large-scale nuclear exchange. Nuclear war was narrowly avoided. And Kennedy said, it's our generation's duty to face this challenge, that we're faced with this hour of maximum danger, but you know what? That's our purpose for being here, and the parallels to where we are today, and with the climate crisis particularly, couldn't be stronger. In a way, the enemy that Kennedy faced was so much more tangible. You could point to a thing. There are nuclear weapons. There are, tensions between countries. It's so much harder with climate change because it's everything that we do and how we do it. And it requires a transformation of everything that we do. That is enormous as a task and an undertaking. It is also enormous as an opportunity. Don't you think we can make the world a better place together? And if climate change requires that we tweak everything that we do in the built environment to decarbonize it, isn't that an opportunity to do other things and to address social justice issues, anti-racism, and the spread of pandemics and things like that? So in a Kennedy-like spirit, I feel like our generation is confronted with both this enormous challenge of climate change, but also this enormous opportunity. And I'd like to talk about that. So we all know what we're here for today. Here we are at the Paris Agreement reset moment. And the Paris Accord was an enormously important threshold, as we heard from Farhana a little bit this morning, that this was a struggle to get climate change to be a conversation among the nations and to have this be a positive conversation that everybody could agree on. It failed over the course of more than 20 years to get to the point that it got to in 2015. So let's not minimize how important that moment was. Let's also not minimize how important Ed Mazaria and Architecture 2030 and this whole discussion of the building sector and the ability of the building sector to move from being a principal source of greenhouse gas to principal solution to the climate crisis, and just how important that was. We've seen various versions of this chart many times, I'm sure. We recognize, I actually feel like there's two interpretations of this. One is to recognize that the built environment per se is responsible for a full half of greenhouse gas emissions in one way or another. But if you look at it as holistically civilization is 100% responsible for all of the greenhouse gas emissions, and we shape civilization by shaping the built environment. So the job really is ours to tackle. And the other thing that the Buildings Day at COP21 defined was a clear path forward. And we talked about this today, and we've heard Ed Mazaria's update about this today. But these three basic paradigm shifts are all the essentials. We must depend on renewable energy. It is time to get rid of fossil fuels. The fossil fuel industry is acting like big tobacco and pretending that there's not a problem with smoking. And they just went through an experience this spring of having their product go from $50 a barrel to zero in a month. You would think that would motivate them to begin to really understand that it's time for a thoughtful transition that takes no longer than 10 years and get out of the fossil fuel business. And then making buildings operationally efficient, and then making the embodied carbon of buildings, the things we make buildings out of, carbon neutral as well. And the story that Ed told today is about the awakening of just checking back in on Paris and realizing that it's time to up the game quite a bit. And I want to talk about how existing buildings and sustainable stewardship is basically an important part of this. So I've shown you my work, and I'll give you just another little example of this at the National Academy of Sciences building here in Washington, D.C. I'm sure that every one of you look at this slide and say, yep, that's a beautiful historic building. Guess what? There are not many buildings that are that gorgeous. And you're absolutely right. So fortunate to be able to work with a project like this. But think of it also as a project with heavy restrictions, heavy constraints on what is appropriate to be done with such a gorgeous building. And despite those, that sense of a very, very high mark, a high agenda must be set with the historic preservation of this building, we were still able to incorporate renewable energy into this project. And in fact, this project has been open now for almost 10 years. This is the building in which the highest level global climate change discussions happens at the National Academy of Science right here. Those scientists walk in this space and they get to see at every one of these conferences that even a historic building of this character, this beauty, is part of the climate change solution. Here's renewable energy right in this historic building. So let's take that attitude forward and really try to project it to how we understand about carbon in buildings. And I'm sure you've seen presented before that, in the kind of conventional way that we look at how building performance happens and how buildings are built, kind of conventional practice is that in the time scale of about 20 years, the operating greenhouse gas emissions about equal the embodied carbon emissions that took to build that building. That's actually a very generous number. It can be 20 years, 40 years, 60 years, 80 years. I mean, I just saw a project that was touting its greenness and it was going to recapture the embodied carbon in 60 years. That's a long time frame in our world today. But the notion of really how we look at operational carbon is something that's quite familiar. And as the years go by and we're mostly consuming fuels, that we're adding to this greenhouse gas footprint of the building. And if you lower that, and this diagram basically shows a 75% improvement, this is not just something that happens in quantity, it is also something that is affected over time. And I want to just introduce this time scale to our thinking about carbon, because the time scale is so important. Embodied carbon also has a time scale. And that is even one that is a little harder for most people to understand. But this is the embodied carbon footprint of a typical building, where you see most of the footprint is from creating the really substantial construction of the building structure. And then to that is added the site improvements that need to be done with paving and so on, the enclosure, the exterior envelope, the skin, which we're going to talk a lot about, the mechanical systems, the space plan term to just the partitioning and the finishes and things like that, and then ultimately the furnishings and finishes that we change quite regularly. You know, it is perfectly standard human behavior to feel like you've had enough of the paint scheme every 10 years or so. So what is the time implication of this? How does this actually change over time? And what happens is that these different elements of the building have different life cycles, and they are improved over a sequence which is inherent to that material. So we need to start thinking about embodied carbon as something that also has a time frame that's associated with it. So what does this all mean in the real context of the buildings and the cities that we're dealing with today? And what's a path forward? How do we really make this work at scale? And, you know, this morning, Ed Masria talked about what I love the description that he sometimes uses, the mountains and the carpets of buildings, and that, you know, our modern cities have these giant mountains of buildings with relatively few very large buildings that are about half the carbon footprint of this, and then the surrounding carpet of low scale buildings, which is about the other half. We need to pay a little more attention, and we added a lot to be learned from paying attention to just the statistics of the building stock. This is the US building stock kept with the database of the Residential Energy Consumption Survey and the Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey, which is a federally kept building database in the United States of America. And the US is pretty unique. This diagram for the US looks different from almost any other country. 200 billion square feet of a total of 324 billion square feet of buildings that exist today, more or less, about 2 years ago, really, when last time the statistics were released. About 200 billion plus is single family houses. That's very unusual. But the other 123 billion is subdivided between multifamily, commercial, and institutional. Well, what does all that mean? It tells us about the character of the buildings that we're having to contend with. What is the character of the existing building stock? And this is a diagram that's a chart from the Commercial Building and Energy Survey, which is kind of the world that I mostly travel in with commercial and institutional buildings. And you can see here that you start to get a message about the characteristic of the challenges and the characteristic of the solutions that we must seek just by looking at the statistics here. So the orange buildings are those buildings that are pre-World War II and tend to be buildings like the National Academy of Sciences buildings that I show you. They fit into those orange bars. The blue bars are the mid-century modern buildings that were that world that Ed Masria talked about this morning that was created almost overnight. And from the end of the Second World War on, the cities around the world have been completely transformed into this modern era mode. And what are those buildings like? Before I leave this slide, I just want to mention that this is also showing the impact of the doubling of the building stock by 2060, which is talked about often about, oh my gosh, think of this incredible amount of growth. And it is an incredible amount of growth. But look, it's not that unprecedented. And by the way, look at all the other buildings. So half of the buildings in 2060 are going to be the buildings that already exist today. So even from that perspective, half of our challenge over the next decades, and it's actually more than half of our challenge over the next decades, is contending with the carbon footprint that is being produced by those buildings. And so the 20th century buildings are different. Ed talked about Corbu and his 5 principles and so on. They're larger scale buildings. They tend to have a frame for their construction rather than bearing walls for their construction. There tends to be a skin that is applied to that frame that frankly can be removed and modified in a way that a bearing wall building, really was really restricted at. So it's a fundamentally different challenge than what was the challenge to be dealing with 19th century and early 20th century buildings. There's actually quite a bit of questioning and research that has been done. This is a study that was published by Terrapin Bright Green, which is Bill Browning after he left Rocky Mountain Institute, one of his undertakings. And this is a look at those mid-century towers in New York City, and basically damning them with faint praise. I mean, they're difficult buildings. They were built addicted to fossil fuels, with lack of operable windows, a complete dependence on motorized mechanical systems, electrified lighting, et cetera. When you unplug them, which happens when there's a blackout or something like that, they become completely uninhabitable. There's no light, there's no air, there's no elevator, there's no nothing. You can't inhabit them. That we ever accepted a standard like that is a bit of a mystery to me. And that's one of my perspectives about having dealt with 19th and 18th and 17th century buildings, that didn't happen to them. But another reason why it's very important for us to be contending with these mid-century buildings is the Penn Station of modern buildings is literally happening right now. And those of you in the preservation field know what I'm saying by that reference to Penn Station. In the early 1960s, Pennsylvania Station in New York City got torn down, and people strived for years to prevent it from happening, but it happened anyhow. It was considered to be a level of urban vandalism which was totally unacceptable. And it essentially created the political will to create the historic preservation regimen that exists in the United States of America. Excuse me, the Historic Preservation Act of 1966 was passed just a year or two after the demolition began at Penn Station. Well, the first 50-plus story building in New York City that was built in the 60s. In fact, the work of Natalie Dubois, who was Skidmore, Owings & Merrill's only female design, senior designer, is being demolished as we speak. And it is a level of urban vandalism that we just can't accept. It is throwing so much away. It's just not okay. And we're just at the beginning of it, and we really need to present an alternative future for these buildings. Well, what is that alternative future? I show this slide, and for preservationists, sometimes you can almost hear people's minds getting blown, because it's just, is this really preservation? Is this really a good reuse of a modern era building? And what you see here is a typical modern era building. This one's in Washington, D.C., right around the corner from my office. It is completely gutted. The skin is completely removed. A couple of stories are added to the top because the structure will, with a few adjustments, will allow a couple of more stories of construction to be born on top of the existing structure. And then it's completely reclad, all new skin, all new services, all new space plan, all new finishes, and so on. I would actually argue that this is an important model, and it's one to be emulated with our difficult era of modern era buildings. And I'd also just reference that there's been quite a lot of this that has been done over the last 20 years or so, as these buildings have simply aged out, have reached the point where they must have significant work done to them. They've just, it's just like people. They get old. They need some work done. People don't get to have nearly as much work done on them as buildings do. But so here are three examples. Lever House on the right, it looks exactly like the pre-existing building did. essentially considered to be a landmark historic building because of its significance. You know, Ed Masri again showed it this morning as kind of a symbol of the modern era having really come to fruition in 1952. So that important historic building was reclad to look exactly as it looked before the recladding. But in this photograph, you see almost no existing original material. This is all new. In the middle, the Celebrezzi Federal Building in Cleveland is a very different approach where the existing material is essentially kept, but then overclad with a second facade, which was a glass, an all glass facade. So you end up with a double skin, much higher performance than just a single skin. And everything is essentially kept. That embodied carbon, those materials are retained. And then the last, the one on the left, the Green Wyatt Federal Building in Portland, that's an example of doing what was done with Lever House, except not just putting it back the way it was, thinking about the design as a solar-oriented, climate-specific design solution. So this is a view of the west facade, which has these trellises that brise soleil on them. They're actually literally vines growing up these now. And so the western facade is designed to mitigate the harsh western sun on this building. So there's real design opportunity here, and there's real opportunity to change the performance of a building when you do this. Well, all three of these seem to be awfully aggressive interventions in these buildings. Obviously, there's a big embodied carbon footprint that is part of this. Well, let's look at that in a little more detail. And I'm going to show you a Quinn Evans project that's a Detroit a roughly 15-story, 14-story building in Detroit, originally built as an office building, as it probably is obvious looking at it. And our project was to convert it to housing. So it's a substantial transformation of the building. Obviously, to do that, the whole inside, everything about the space plan and the systems completely redone. Total, gut rehab, completely redone inside. And then the question really became, what did we do with the skin? Do we keep it or do we change it? And what are the options for changing it? And then, of course, we retain the structure. And you can see that here, that I would say that this is kind of the scope of renovation for almost any one of these mid-century buildings that we would look at would have this essentially the same set of questions about it. Well, you're going to retain the structure. You're going to keep that basic structural material framework of the building. And then what do you do with the skin? And then, of course, you're going to do a lot to the interior in order to repurpose it to the new uses that you want to put it to. And I would say that an awful lot of the work that we see is really about going from other uses to housing, or at least mixed use. And what we found on the embodied carbon side when we looked at this is that the skin was a relatively small amount of the embodied carbon scenario. The interior work was, pretty substantially 2, almost 3 times more embodied energy related to those interior partitioning and ceilings and so on. And then also the systems, the mechanical systems and electrical and lighting and so on. But you can see here that the structure, this seemingly, gosh, what a low level, idea of preservation. All you're keeping is the structure. Well, even just doing that is actually an enormously positive thing to do, incredibly positive. It takes our embodied carbon formula for a building like this into a completely different realm. You can see here that it's 2 times, almost 3 times the embodied carbon if we had replaced the structure of this building. So there's a lot of reasons to really consider these buildings carefully and to understand how to intervene with them, being sensitive to their building life cycles, if you will. And so let's talk about this paradigm of redesign. What does it really look like? And as I said just a minute ago, life cycles. Buildings are onions with layers of life cycle that you peel away. A building code absolutely requires that you have a fireproof building, an earthquake-proof building, a storm-proof building, a terrorist-proof building. I mean, you must create incredibly robust buildings to meet the building code, as you should. Well, if you do that and you build a concrete frame or a cross-laminated timber frame or a steel frame, properly treated, that will last for hundreds, even thousands of years. That will just last forever if it's just simply taken care of. The skin, on the other hand, will need some kind of intervention, something like every 50 years. And I can tell you from my experience as a preservation architect, whether that's a 300-year-old granite building or whether it's a curtain wall building, that 40 or 50-year cycle that you must pay attention to the skin and do what's needed for the skin is proven time and time again. We have the protocols, we have the frameworks for understanding life cycle, and we just have to apply it to every layer of the onion and ask ourselves what we've learned when we do that. And we also have the tools that now are literally integrated into our design process, our architecture and engineering and construction processes that literally give us the information that we need to know when we make a decision, what the implications of that decision are on certainly the operational carbon, and then also on the embodied carbon, and the importance of redesign and reuse, in really being smart about embodied carbon. And there's a lot about the tools. I won't go into them. I'll just say simply that, what our ability to benchmark, compare, measure, really get to a solid evidence-based answer is very high. We can really, really understand the implication of the decisions that we're making. And I just will dwell on this for just another minute, that it does take a little nuanced thinking. And this is the concrete diagrams from MIT's CS Hub, that the materiality of concrete and the greenhouse gas emissions from concrete are two very different charts. And it tells you the importance of focusing on cement content and cement production processes. So you have to sweat the details. And when you do, you learn a great deal about the importance of your decisions. And I want to kind of just, make the kind of final chapters of this discussion today to just kind of mention a couple things about our own value system and how we can approach this. We've heard a lot of things today about carbon positive, and the word positive is a really important part of that. How do we see these challenges as opportunities? How do we see the future architectural profession just delighting in the opportunity to work with building conversion and rebirth and redesign and repurposing and so on? It's important, and frankly, there is a tremendous opportunity there. So we start by understanding that we have impacts and holding ourselves accountable for them, which is literally something that literally goes back to the beginning of the environmental movement, with the kind of popularization of it for most people in the United States, at least, through Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, who lived just a few miles from where I'm sitting today. The historic preservation movement itself was a movement. This is Philip Johnson and Peggy Guggenheim picketing on 8th Avenue, trying to save Penn Station in New York City. It didn't succeed, but these are important social movements that we're part of. Well, we have to learn to love all buildings. They all have value. And this is about my favorite Quinn Evans project that's ever been done. A pretty modest, what was originally an apartment building in Detroit, Michigan, 71 Garfield Street, that was part of the Harlem Renaissance era of the African-American core in downtown Detroit. So in my mind, it's an important historic site, as well as being a pile of bricks. And that pile of bricks, I know that when every architect or owner looks at a building that's in this kind of condition, it's hard to find the value there, but there is. And in the first place, it can be a beautiful place to live again, and it can contribute to that story of the Harlem Renaissance, the Blue Hill district of Detroit. And it also is a building that can be done using every green practice that is available to us. And there's no reason why we shouldn't consider the renovation of buildings like this, the rebirth of buildings like this, as being an important act of greening. And I just want to talk about that a minute, about what do we think about when we think about greening, and what is our model? And I just want to say that it is a highly technology dependent model. We have buildings with mechanical systems that are all automated, and they're responding, in this case with the Edge in Amsterdam, the Deloitte headquarters, literally kind of biofeedback badges that people are wearing, and they know whether your heart rate is too low, and it will, you'll get a message on your screen like a Fitbit saying get up and move around, you've been sitting too long. This is all fine. It's highly technology dependent, and that hasn't always been the case. And what is known as passive design, which I think is totally mistermed, is there are ways to do this that are not so technology dependent, and I would even say that are more engaging to the building occupants. I would like to get up and open a window when I'm too hot, or close it when I'm too cold, or whatever. That engages me with my environment. I prefer that as an approach, as to have the building doing all the thinking for me. And the historic building stock really teaches you this. And I just want you to know that even modern architects, there's this guy, Ed Mazria, I think, remember his name correctly, who basically, this is where Ed started, was really understanding that buildings can be smart, and how we design buildings can be smart and impactful. There doesn't need to be a technical gizmo to answer every question for you. And I want to end this by just noting the importance, maybe somewhat like what Peter Calthorpe was talking about. This is the era of the climate crisis, but it is also the dawning of the urban era, and those two things work together. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Sustainable Development Goals that were developed just 6 months before the Paris Summit. You're probably also familiar with the Habitat 3 Summit that took place in Quito, Ecuador, just 6 months after the Paris Summit, in which the New Urban Agenda, as it was called, was released by the United Nations. So these two agendas, of climate change agenda and the urban agenda, are literally mutually supportive agendas. And what it means for the building stock is the building stock has to become positive. It has to become a positive solution to all the things that we need to have a sustainable urban environment. And it can. And the two that we're focused on with climate change is that buildings can generate green power and buildings can sequester carbon, but it's only part of a holistic understanding of, I'm absolutely treading on the same path as Peter Calthorpe. He referenced this quote earlier. We like to think about design mattering. Well, design impact matters. We don't just shape buildings, we shape lives. And it just brings us right back to that moment, the early years, the beginning of my career, and Kennedy recognizing the importance of addressing the issues that that his generation must confront. And we are now at our generation having to confront the new urban agenda and the climate emergency. And like Kennedy, we have to both hold ourselves accountable for it. But just like Kennedy took the arms race and he turned it into the space race, and for something that advanced humankind, we have this opportunity with the climate emergency that we're faced with. It isn't just a chance for us to stop doing bad. It's a chance for us to be carbon positive and to find a way for our cities and our buildings to be something that make the lives of the people that live there just more joyful, more inspiring, more beautiful lives to live. And that is our opportunity that I welcome as an architect. That is the climate crisis opportunity. So thank you for taking some time and sharing these things with me. So Aaron, on to Q&A.
On to Q&A. Thank you so much, Carl. That was fantastic. We probably are not going to have time to answer every question that came in, but I would like to start with one that I think you might have some good insight on, which is, what about buildings that are both ugly and unsustainable, or built in remote locations or other? What do you think about valuing those buildings, and how do you go about valuing them?
So everything but the built in bad locations part of it, I would say, doesn't really matter, you know. So, you know, the 71 Garfield Street in the condition that it was when we came to it, you would sure call that an ugly building. Well, when we were done with it, it wasn't. I think there was, a typical developer would look at a building like that building that I showed, 2101 L Street in Washington, and say, that's an ugly building. And when it was done, it wasn't an ugly building anymore. I do think that mostly with location, there are buildings that are in locations that can have such a high infrastructure, you know, debit to them, or such a high transportation burden that it truly doesn't make sense to continue to occupy them or to continue to invest in them. But in urbanized areas, I would challenge you to say that virtually every building is worth paying attention to. And hey, if it's ugly, make it beautiful.
Great answer. Another couple of questions that if you can answer them quickly, great. If not, answers will be up on the website as a reminder to all attendees. There were a couple really around the time value of carbon, a specific one about your thoughts on 20-year GWP versus 100-year, but again, kind of a broader explanation again of that time value of carbon concept.
So we have to be thinking about what do we do in the next 20 years? And the most important thing that we can do in the next 20 years is avoiding spending carbon. So, you know, I was former president of the American Institute of Architects. They can't throw me out now for saying this, but we need to build less. We need to renovate more, okay? So just let's use what we have. But I do think that you also have to recognize that even in the simplest thing that you're doing, you are investing things now that will last for a very long time. And don't just think about 20 years or 40 years or 50 years. Seventh generation notion, that's 200 years. We should be thinking about 200 years when we invest in buildings.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Carl, again, for a really compelling presentation. I am going to close this session out now because our next set of sessions is starting in less than 1 minute. So I hope all of the attendees will go back to carbonpositive.org, look at the agenda, and find another session to join. Thank you.
Bye-bye.